Take a look at this. This is Bayern's shape in possession. Notice anything odd? Well, these are their two most attacking players on paper. But if they're in the deep pivot positions, then who's up front? Well, that's their right back. And this wasn't a random once-off occurrence, it was actually a key pillar in how Bayern broke down Chelsea. And the funny thing is Chelsea's own tactical plan was pretty solid, but this was a day where Bayern's risks paid off and Chelsea's did not. So let's take a look at the tactics from both teams. Early in the encounter, when they were building from deep, Bayern would shift into a back three, with Kimmich looking for spaces outside the centre-backs and between the centre-backs, like in our previous breakdown of their opening league match against Leipzig. But Chelsea were fairly comfortable pressing more man-to-man in these situations, and unlike that Leipzig match, Bayern identified the opponent's weakness was not down the right, but instead it was the other flank because of how Chelsea set up in their defense. See, when Chelsea were defending, they were in an extremely lopsided 4-5-1, with Palmer at times just looking like a tucked-in winger. But especially if Neuer was the third man, allowing the left centre-back wider, or if Tah was just being more aggressive in pushing high with the ball, Palmer could very quickly be drawn into the centre-forward position, making it a lopsided 4-4-2. But here's the thing, none of the midfielders were shifting across to cover when Palmer was coming central, occasionally leading to bizarre situations where Stanisic at left back was receiving an acres of space without much pressure on him at all. We'll circle back to this because it's inseparable from what happened through the centre of the park. See, whenever possible, Chelsea were looking to be extremely aggressive in their man-to-man press of Bayern's own midfield. And how Bayern looked to break this was through constant rotations. But where usually it's just the centre forward dropping deep and a midfielder looking to run beyond, Kompany took this to the next level, with both the forward and the attacking midfielder dropping extremely deep. This forced Chelsea into decisions, and often they looked to continue to be aggressive with their man-to-man press, meaning a defensive midfielder and a centre-back were being drawn out of position, leaving gaping holes in the most important parts of the pitch if you're the defending team. And strangely enough, in the first half, if Neuer was the third man, with Stanisic ready to receive on the outside of Palmer, and Olise holding the width down the right, it was Laimer from right back who often had the freedom to operate as a free man, finding space wherever appropriate. Chelsea were quickly being forced into trade-offs, because we could at times see the remaining pivot, often Caicedo, dropping off. But that would mean that the aggressive man-to-man press in the midfield had all of a sudden disappeared. So the Blues could instead shift to a hybrid system that combined both zonal and man-to-man principles, where when the forwards initially began to drop deep, the centre-back and the pivot would be man-to-man whilst their men were in their zones. And once they dropped too deep, they would then look to pass that man on to one of their teammates higher up the pitch. And that does sound great in theory, and it did work at times, but this system requires immaculate communication, so switching to it mid-match when the opponent is consistently rotating isn't the easiest thing to do. And it led to sequences like this, where James is initially picking up Gnabry. Gnabry then rotates with Pavlovic, and James is unsure whether he should pick him up or Kane. Chalobah then picks Kane up. And now James and Palmer are unsure on who should pick up the dropping Pavlovic and who should pick up the left back instead. Run it on, and it culminates in a scenario like this, where 4 Chelsea men are picking up 2 Bayern men. Nothing comes of it, but it shows how Bayern's rotations were able to unsettle Chelsea. But remember that left-hand side we talked about earlier? Well, it came back to haunt Chelsea, as when Palmer was drawn in and the left back, Stanisic in the first half and Laimer in the second, got in possession, Gusto would look to press to prevent easy progression. But that distance would mean often the left back had time to get their head up and assess the situation before Gusto got to them. All of this was combined with both Kane and Gnabry dropping deep, meaning there were often big gaps in the defense, plus the centre-back who moved out to cover Gusto would now be isolated on the flank. But it could be so much worse than just an isolation, as we saw midfielders then looking to move wide for a potential 2 versus 1 against Chalobah. But this is the best example of the danger that Bayern created. Laimer receives outside of Palmer and draws Gusto high up the pitch. Gnabry and Diaz have rotated, but the principle is the same. One Chelsea centre-back is drawn wide, and the other is drawn high onto the dropping Kane, and Diaz begins to draw Caicedo, much like Gnabry had been doing. So Laimer plays into Diaz and makes the supporting run, and because Bayern have forced this odd positioning of the centre-backs, Laimer has acres of space to run into. He then draws Tosin with the ball, which creates space for Harry Kane, who has a huge chance. Chelsea didn't have as much of the ball, but let's examine a couple of interesting tactical elements by Maresca. And if you're enjoying this tactical breakdown and want to learn the fundamentals of analysis for free, check out Tactics 12 through the top link in the description, where over 12 days I'll teach you the basics of analysis. Chelsea's game plan from the goal kick was to maintain a fairly traditional back four. And just like their out of possession phases, Palmer was not operating like a traditional winger, moving infield early instead. And in these phases, Kane and Gnabry were the front two for Bayern, with these three men looking to be narrow on the two pivots. What this shape allowed for Bayern is no matter which flank Chelsea built down, Bayern could get immediate pressure on the backline. And once the fullback got on the ball side winger could then apply pressure on that fullback, while the ball far winger picked up the far side pivot, ensuring that there were no easy outlets through the center. And in that deeper open play build-up, Bayern were in a 4-4-2, with Chelsea reverting to their 3-5-2, with Gusto pushing on while Cucurella tucked in, which is quite interesting because in more recent times, we've seen more of a single pivot system from Chelsea to allow three men between the lines. But this more secure double pivot system might be their approach against higher caliber opponents this season. And if Chelsea took defensive risks by giving the Bayern left back space, Bayern took the word risk to the next level. Of course, the issue for Bayern when they were in this 4-4-2 is that they were 4 versus 2 down in the midfield, and their double pivot was committed to trying to stop Chelsea playing high up the pitch by pushing up here, which then left the two 10s free. The Bavarians took risks by being aggressive with the man-to-man press, having a defender push onto Enzo, and Upamecano was often tasked with being hyper-aggressive on the remaining 10, meaning that Tar was often 1 versus 1 against João Pedro, and we saw them duking it out in the first half, leading to a Tar booking and a half-time substitution. Chelsea were also having success with their front five, as the 5 versus 4 advantage allowed them to manipulate the Bayern backline. Like down the left, Neto would draw in Lima, and if Fernandes moved across, 2 of Chelsea's backline had been drawn wide, creating room here for a forward to run into, potentially creating a 1 versus 1 again. Or even simple switch situations like this, that saw Gusto consistently get into dangerous positions, as Palmer's infield runs would draw in the fullback, leaving Gusto with space to make the run. It's safe to say this was one of the most tactically fascinating matches of the season so far, but few matches compare to the tactical insanity of this match on screen now. If you want a deeper dive into one of the craziest tactical matches of recent times, click on screen now. And don't forget to check out Tactics 12 through the link in the description below.